Hi everyone. Now it's Rivers Week here on Viking.TV. So today we're going to focus on one of the world's greatest rivers, which flows from its source high up in the Swiss Alps to its mouth 800 miles further down on the Dutch coast. A river of great contrasts that passes through 6 countries and has played a crucial role in shaping not only Europe's history, but also its present and future. As you have probably guessed by now, I'm talking, of course, about the mighty river Rhine. And to quote Victor Hugo, the Rhine is unique. It combines the qualities of every river, mysterious like the Nile, spangled with gold like an American river, and like a river of Asia, abounding with phantoms and fables. And so to guide us on our journey, we are accompanied by someone who has run, walked, cycled, rode and swam along the Rhine waters. And then he wrote a book about it. He is the author, Ben Coates. Ben, welcome to In Conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Ben, thank you for joining us. Before we talk about the River Rhine, I thought maybe we could just find out a little bit more about you yourself. You come originally from the United Kingdom, but like me, you are an expatriate and joining us now from your home in the Netherlands. Could you describe it for us a little bit and say how you came to be living there?
Sure. Well, I'm sitting here, as you said, at my home, which is a small cottage in the Dutch countryside, not far from Gouda or Gouda, as if you're not Dutch, you might pronounce it. Very cliched, I suppose, traditional Dutch scenery. I'm looking out of the window here right now, green fields and cows and windmills and church steeples in the distance and all of that stuff, but very pretty, very peaceful. I wound up here, I guess, pretty much by accident. I was traveling in Latin America, I suppose 10 or 12 years ago, and I met a young Dutch lady, had a nice evening in a bar, chatting with her over a beer, nothing particularly romantic or extraordinary, but a good conversation. And at the end of it, I managed to get her phone number. And then something like 4 or 5 months later, I was on a flight that was diverted due to bad weather to Amsterdam instead of going back to London, where I was living at the time. And so I gave this Dutch lady a call and said, hey, I'm stuck here in Amsterdam. I think you live somewhere in the Netherlands, don't you? Would you like to have a coffee or dinner or something? And 10, 12 years later, I'm still here. We're married, sitting here in our cottage in the countryside. Got a Dutch family. I have a Dutch passport now as well, speaking the language. And yeah, I guess I'm pretty much stuck here now, for better or worse.
Wow, it's amazing. You see what happens when there's a girl in a bar. It's a terrible combination.
Yeah, you got to be careful.
But and do you actually live near the Rhine?
Yes, well, I mean, one of the things I describe in the book is the Rhine's geography in the Netherlands, at least, is actually slightly complicated in that it doesn't just flow very directly from point to point in the way that you might think of the Thames or the Mississippi does. In that the whole of the Netherlands basically forms the Rhine Delta, and the river gets to about Utrecht, somewhere in the central Netherlands, and sort of fractures into this huge delta that ends up covering in various channels, various rivers with unpronounceable Dutch names, flowing into the sea at lots of points along the Dutch coast. But one of those sort of main historic branches is the Oude Rhine, the Old Rhine, flowing up through Leiden to the sea and into the North Sea. And I live not far from there now. I actually cycled along a bit of it today in the sunshine with all the boats and the other cyclists. Very pretty, tranquil scenery.
Because I think you, if I remember rightly, in your book, you described that whole Rhine Delta is, looking like a glass of beer thrown across a bar floor. I mean, apart from anything else, Holland being such a wet country, it is, as you say, that it's not a question of a river with just a source and a mouth. It's more fractured than that, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I think, if you got out a map now or looked on Google Maps or something, you can follow with your finger or your cursor the course of the river pretty clearly from Switzerland all the way up through Liechtenstein and Austria and France and Germany and so on. But then, as I said, once you get about halfway across the Netherlands, it just sort of dissolves into this mass of smaller channels, the Lek and the Waal and the Maas and the Dordtse Kil and the Nieuwe Waterweg. And as I said, all these often unpronounceable for foreigners, smaller channels. The main one is the Nieuwe Waterweg and the Maas, which is still a pretty major river and flows through Rotterdam, which lots of people have heard of, and into into the North Sea just past Rotterdam, and you still have one of the biggest ports in Europe there, by far the biggest port actually in Europe, carrying an awful lot of trade and traffic. If you're in London, for example, and you buy a product that's been made in Germany, or consume something that's using German chemicals or German paint or German fuel, there's a pretty good chance it's ended up coming along the river and out through Rotterdam to reach you.
And just tell us, what kind of work were you doing, Ben, before you moved to Holland?
Before I moved to Holland, I was working in politics in London. I was a political advisor for about, I guess, 5 or 6 years in Westminster. Got a bit sick of that, fair to say. Lots of fun, but also a bit frustrating. Not something I wanted to sort of spend my whole life doing, writing speeches for other people and giving people witty comebacks to difficult questions on the news and that kind of thing. So as I said, I washed up here and haven't done any political work since then. And now I just juggle a few different things. I do a bit of work for international organizations on communications and things in the Netherlands, but also a lot of writing and journalism. As we said, a couple of books and various articles for Dutch and British and Brussels-based publications on things like Dutch history, culture, the politics of Northern Europe, those kind of things, which I enjoy. It's a lot of fun. Pleasures to do it.
And I learned that at one time you lived near another of the world's great rivers, the Nile. Is that correct?
I did, yeah. I lived for just over a year, I suppose, just outside Kampala, not too far from Jinja, where the source of the, not the source of the Nile, sorry, where the mouth of the Nile flows into Lake Victoria, which, yeah, is quite different from the Rhine, obviously, very different scenery. But I have a lot of happy memories of days swimming and canoeing and hiking along the Nile there, which I guess in some ways maybe inspired me to seek out the source of the Rhine as well when I got back.
Ben, there's one thing we should clear up before we get on to talking about the Rhine in detail, and that is the difference, which I, again, got this from your book, the difference between the Netherlands and Holland, and which is the correct appellation to use, because there is an important difference. Could you just talk us through that?
Yeah, it's a common question, actually. I mean, some people would say both are correct, and you certainly, some Dutch people are a bit touchy about the difference, but a lot, I think, would use both fairly interchangeably. When we had the recent European Football Championships, for example, you would have heard a lot of Dutch people cheering for Holland, Hope Holland. But technically, the name of the country is the Netherlands, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and Holland is just one small part of that. How it works, the Netherlands is divided up into 12 provinces, much the same way as England would be divided into counties or the US into different states. 2 of those Dutch provinces are Noord-Holland and Zuid-Holland, North Holland and South Holland, out on the coast. And they are the 2 provinces, although they're not particularly big in geographic terms, they're the ones where most of the big cities that people would have heard of internationally, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Delft, Haarlem, all those places are in North or South Holland. Most of the population lives there, most of the money gets made there, a lot of the politics gets done there. And so for that reason, people tend to, I suppose, use Holland as a bit of a shorthand for the name of the country at large. I guess in much the same way as people might say England when what they technically mean is the UK, and they would say Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister of England, but really they're not referring specifically to England, but to the bigger country around it as well. But as I said, technical mistake perhaps, but an entirely forgivable one, I think.
Oh, well, that's good to know. We're glad we cleared that up anyway. I was super impressed when I learned that you can speak Dutch, especially when the Netherlands is one of those rare places in the world where it's possible to live and work successfully without ever having to learn the native language. So just, I mean, it doesn't sound like an easy language to learn, Dutch. I think you describe it in the book as sounding a little like a drunk man gargling. It's got a, I mean, it doesn't sound to me as easy as it would be, say, Italian or Spanish, for example.
Yeah, certainly. I think compared to a lot of languages, if you're not a native speaker, the pronunciation can be quite tricky. There's the famous Dutch, the g, which is in a lot of words. So you think of a phrase like graag gedaan is sort of you're welcome. You know, I was happy to do that for you. And just getting you're choking yourself on trying to pronounce that can be a bit of a challenge at first. I did have a few lessons when I first got here, just perhaps 12 or 15 lessons or something to get me started, but then ended up learning most of the language just from watching TV, watching a lot of foreign television actually with Dutch subtitles. I found that worked for me, just to read the language and then figure out the pronunciation later. And I've got to a point now where I think I can fit in pretty well. And if I had a chat with someone in the street, they perhaps wouldn't guess that I wasn't born here, which is nice. But I'm still, if you wanted to have a very serious conversation about rocket science or heart surgery or something, I would fall apart pretty quickly. I think, as you say, compared to some languages, it's very, very hard for a foreigner to fully master. And there's not many people I've met who grew up abroad, started learning Dutch as an adult and could pass as a fully native born Dutch, as it were. So still a ways to go.
Because every time I go to the Netherlands, I am just blown away by how it's not just in the city set. I mean, it just seems like everybody can speak not only English but speak good English. And there's only one other country I've come across something similar, and that is Norway, where it's kind of, not quite to the Dutch extent. I believe it's something like 90% of Dutch people speak English, which is incredible when you think about it. How come? Why are they so good at English compared to say the Germans or the French, Italians?
I think it's, to start with, it is true. If you look at the data, for example, the proportion that speak English is extremely high, well over 90% in most surveys. And as you say, I think what's striking is that obviously English is more commonly spoken in the big touristy international cities like Amsterdam or The Hague, for example. But even if you come out in the countryside, like where I live, for example, in the small villages around here, even older people who've never traveled or worked internationally or read an English language book or anything like that, if you talk to them, they would insist they don't speak English and they're hopeless with languages. But then actually, they're pretty close to being fluent, I think. I've said before, I think as a Brit, if you can order a glass of wine in another language, you consider yourself fluent. But if you're Dutch, you can probably negotiate a UN Security Council resolution or something and still consider you're not fluent at all. There's various reasons for that. It's famously an international country, lots of international trade, very open borders, big expat population and so on. So I think there is a kind of tradition there of being open to the world and trading and networking and being unafraid to use other languages. But I think a lot of it comes down to just the small size of the country, actually. I'm often struck if you go to France or Germany, for example, as you'll know, living in France, if you switch on the television, you might well see an episode of The Simpsons or Law and Order or an old Tom Cruise movie or whatever it is on television. And it'll almost always be dubbed into the local language. Whereas in the Netherlands, if you watch those same programs, they're almost always still in the original English or American English, and then have Dutch subtitles put over the top. And I think that's largely just because the market here isn't really big enough to make it sustainable or profitable to dub every single program into the local language. And that means people just grow up watching TV in another language a lot of the time. And a lot of these people who, as I said, wouldn't necessarily have studied English or think of themselves as particularly fluent in it, they've probably, watched every episode of Friends when they were a teenager in the original English. And simply from that, they have quite a rich knowledge of the language and very up to date with all the idioms and much more fluent than people in other countries would be. But it is impressive. And I think one of the things that makes it very easy to live here or travel here if you're not born here.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for having TV programs not dubbed. And I still can't get used to watching Friends in French. It's a little, put it mildly. Also, whilst we're talking about the Dutch, just tell me this. Am I right in saying they're the tallest people in the world? And that can't just be so they can see over the top of the dikes. I think the average height of the people of a man in the Netherlands is 6'2", if I remember rightly.
Which is not far off that. Yeah.
So why are they so tall? Why are the Dutch so tall?
Well, it's quite hotly debated, actually, among the scientific community and stuff. I did look into it for one of the books I wrote, and there's a big debate around it. It's obviously, at this point, it's partly genetics, where if the average height of the population is very tall and then they're all having children, those kids tend to grow up tall as well. There's also, perhaps controversially for some, but there's studies showing that taller men are more likely to find a wife or a partner and to have children, and so than shorter men. And so apologies to any shorter viewers watching, but if you're Dutch, you're maybe apparently more likely to have more children if you're taller, so that helps perpetuate it. What's interesting is, I think, if you look at the data going back, there's military records from the 1860s, I think it is, that recorded height in the Netherlands and also in other countries in a lot of detail. And at that point, 150 years ago or so, the Netherlands, the people here weren't particularly tall, and the average Dutch person was actually still, I think, 5 centimeters, so an inch or two shorter than the average American, for example. And then over the last 150 years or so, they had this enormous collective growth spurt and sort of overtaken everyone else in the world. That's partly probably because it's just a wealthy country with good healthcare and social services and so on. But also, I think a lot to do with the diet. And most of the one thing most scientists agree on is that the famous dairy-rich diet, all those cheeses and milks and yogurts and the cows you see everywhere, has had an impact. If people grow up eating a diet that's extremely high in protein, high in calcium, they do tend to be taller than those in countries where they don't do that. But it's truly, it is noticeable, I think, when you're here. I always notice if I go to a music concert or something like that in the UK, I'm about 6'1", so sort of 190 something centimeters. If I go to a concert or a festival in the UK, I'm one of the tallest ones there normally, and I can kind of quite comfortably see over the crowd wherever I stand. And if I go to one in the Netherlands, it's hopeless. I can't see anything. I have to wriggle my way around to the front and stand with the other short people in front of all the tall guys.
Well, if you came to France, you'd be a giant, Ben. I mean, I'm not as tall as you, but I'm, in French terms, I am pretty tall. Anyway, we got you here to talk about the Rhine, so let's dig into that. Ben, was there a moment when the Rhine became more than a name and a line on a map for you, and the idea of traveling its length and writing about it began to take shape?
Yes, well, I mean, I think I said somewhere in the book, I mean, for me to begin with, the Rhine, I'd heard of it, obviously, as everyone has, but it was a bit like Buddhism or the bond market or something, this thing that you're vaguely aware it exists, but you don't really know much about it. You've never given a huge amount of thought to what it does or where it goes. And that changed for me, I suppose it's about 2014, something like that. There was very heavy snowfall in the Netherlands, and all the rivers and canals froze. I was living in the north of Rotterdam at the time, and I, for the first time, bought a pair of ice skates and went out skating, quite hopelessly wobbling around on the ice like a Bambi or something, and careering from tree to tree and knocking other people over quite hopelessly, but had a fantastic time and headed all the way out of town on the River Rotter, for which Rotterdam is named, and went, I don't know, 10 kilometers out of town or something, and had a nice glass of glühwein and then turned around and came back. And when I got home, I thought, wow, that was really fun, to follow the rivers and see where they go. And I got the map out, and it was only at that point, which in retrospect seems ridiculous that I'd never realized it before, that I realized that actually from my own front door, practically in the Netherlands, you could follow these waterways, not just to the end of the street or to the next town over for a glühwein, but in theory, right the way across Europe. And in particular, the same waterways that went right past the end of my street flow indirectly into the River Rhine. This, as we've said, one of the greatest rivers in the world, second longest river in Europe after the Danube. And you could, if you had the time and the energy, you could skate or row or sail all the way from a city like Rotterdam or Utrecht, right up through France, Germany, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria, all the way to the top of the Alps. And so that was more or less what I set out to do, not with the ice skates, unfortunately. The ice didn't last that long, but sort of traveling across Europe to follow the river, learn more about its history, its culture, the effect it's had on Europe, the wars that have been fought over it, the cultures along it, the languages, the foods, but also have a lot of fun visiting different towns and cities and festivals and events all the way along it.
And was there a reason to follow the river from the mouth to the source rather than the other way around, which may appear at first sight a more obvious thing to do? In other words, to go from the mountains, the Alps, to down to Holland rather than going the other way around.
Yeah, I belatedly realized that probably would have been easier, actually, because obviously if you go from the source to the mouth, you're going downhill all the way. And it was only after a few sweaty days cycling and walking and so on that I realized I probably got it the wrong way around. And the further up you go, the steeper it gets. And I was going the wrong way against the gradient. I mean, it was dictated mainly, I think, by just where I was living and where I started from, and this sort of sense of curiosity. I think, to be honest with you, it's also a case of, as with most rivers, the higher up you go, to some extent, the less interesting it gets, if I dare say that. If you go into Switzerland, for example, near the source of the Rhine. It's incredibly beautiful, and you really have these sort of cliched chocolate box scenery of snowy peaks and icy blue lakes and rocky mountain paths and all of that stuff. And it's really a wonderful place to be. But there's also, there's not big towns or cities there. There's not fascinating historical stories and music festivals and wines to taste. It's just a very small mountain stream that you can literally step over in one step at the source. And so it seemed to me, if you're going to write about it and explore it, it's maybe better to start with the interesting, exciting stuff, go to the big cities and where all the battles were fought and the wines were grown and the poetry was written and all of that kind of stuff, and then end up with the beautiful mountain source as a bit of a coda at the end of the story. The sort of, I guess, in the tradition of those River Nile explorers in Africa, the sort of great explorer finally finding the source at the end of the tale and feeling very self-satisfied for having done it. Well, it was a lot of fun.
We'll come on to finding the source, but yeah, I that makes sense. One of the phrases in the book that jumped out at me was that rivers, not just the Rhine, rivers in general, unite along their length, but divide across their breadth, and none more so than the Rhine. Could you just expand on that, Ben? Give some maybe give us some examples of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, Europe is and always has been a patchwork of small states. It's not like the United States, a sort of one big vast landmass united in a single country, more or less, but a patchwork of smaller countries. And a river like the Rhine has always made an irresistible, very convenient boundary for people if you're trying to decide where, for example, France stops and Germany begins, or where the Roman Empire stops and the non-Roman Empire begins. Then the River Rhine is this very convenient natural moat for that. So the Romans, for example, I'll spare you the full history lesson, but basically spread northwards across Italy, from Italy northwards across Europe, conquering territory. And then when they reached the River Rhine in the Netherlands, sort of roughly where Utrecht and Leiden are in the central Netherlands these days, they decided that was the point where they would stop. And they did make incursions further north, and there's lots of bloody, gory battles that I write a bit about in the book, but they basically decided that the people north of that river, the modern day Northern Dutch and Amsterdammers, I suppose, were sort of hopeless heathens, godless, hopeless, bloodthirsty monsters, and they weren't going to bother trying to conquer their useless, boggy land that was half underwater anyway, and they would stop at the Rhine. And so along the Rhine, you had this big essentially string of wooden fortresses built, known as the Limes, big military fortifications at places like Utrecht and Nijmegen, and the Rhine, in that part of Europe at least, was literally the outer limit of the Roman Empire, the place where they stopped. And so, and you see that pattern repeatedly in history in World War II, for example, as well, the famous Operation Market Garden and battles around Arnhem, this sense of the river being a very clear boundary between different forces, and it still forms the boundary today between, as I mentioned, France and Germany, for example, but also skirting along between Germany and Switzerland, Austria and Switzerland, Liechtenstein. So still serves that function. But then, as you said, the sort of flip side of that is, like any river, it also serves to unite along its length. And what I mean by that is a river forms an obvious, convenient, natural boundary between territories, but it also forms an obvious, convenient, natural way to transport goods. And if you think back particularly to an age when there weren't good roads anywhere, and when people didn't have trains and planes and all the rest of it, if you wanted to ship, say, a case of wine from southern Germany to northern Europe, or some olive oil that had been produced in just south of the Italian Alps to the north, then the river would be a perfect, easy way to do it. Chuck it on a wooden barge, put it in the river, and a few days or weeks later, it's arrived at its destination with almost no effort. And you still see that pattern today. As I said, Rotterdam is still today the biggest port in Europe, handling, I think, before the pandemic, well over 1 million tons of cargo a day, a lot of which comes down from France and Switzerland and Germany. And that's inevitably affected, I think, the culture of places along the river, the fact that you have these great cultural influences and trade flowing up and down along it. One thing I write about towards the end of the book was how I personally was struck by how a lot of the places seem to have a lot in common. And you would go to, for example, northern Germany and the east of the Netherlands, and you might think they're different countries with very different histories and cultures and languages and so on. But what's actually striking when you travel up and down is how similar they are, and how you often, it's almost difficult to tell what country you're in if you don't look at the road signs. A lot of the towns, even places like Switzerland compared with Germany and France, a lot of these small towns on the river, they have very similar geography, a very similar feel to them, very similar culture. By the end of it, you can almost, if you've been to a few of them, you can almost sort of recite the history without having looked in the book, the sort of World War II battles and the Romans and the bridges being built and all the rest of it. And so I think there's something interesting there about how these very disparate places are tied together almost as if by a string, and you end up with a situation where a French town on the Rhine might have a lot more in common with a German town on the Rhine than it does with a French town on the Atlantic coast or on the Mediterranean, for example, which I also found interesting.
You know, one of the things that really impressed me when I took a shameless plug here, a Viking Rhine getaway trip from Amsterdam to Basel, was the contrast between the industrial and the urban and the rural parts of the Rhine. And I personally get very excited by industrial landscapes, and I particularly liked the lower Rhine with all its old factories and chimneys and islands outside the river. It's not the prettiest, but it's a good reminder of the economic importance of the Rhine and how it really is a working river.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think very crudely speaking, you could probably divide the Rhine into three sections. You have the north, particularly northern Germany, and to a lesser extent the Netherlands, is, as you say, quite industrial, lots of factories and warehouses and big ships and cranes and that kind of thing. Then the more middle section, so talking sort of central southern Germany, south of Bonn and Koblenz, you have the famous Romantic Rhine, where it's all big, high, rocky canyons and castles and thick green forests and vineyards, really like something from a children's storybook. And then further south still, you have, as I discussed already, the Alpine section, where it's really a sort of rocky mountain stream and clear blue waters flowing over the cliffs and that kind of thing. And yeah, I also had a bit of a soft spot, I have to say, for the industrial section, which I appreciate probably maybe isn't to everyone's taste and somewhere that everyone would want to go on holiday. But I think if you're interested in European history, then it's really a fascinating area. You know, these towns like Duisburg or Düsseldorf, for example, they're probably not, to be honest, going to win awards for the most beautiful city in the world. But they are places where Europe's industrial revolution took place, where a lot of this famous post-war boom in industry took place, where a huge amount of the wealth and the industry that we associate with modern Germany was created. Places like Duisburg, for example, grew so quickly in the late 1800s that there were stories of soldiers coming back from leave and they couldn't find their house anymore because the streets around had been transformed so quickly. Obviously then all hugely destroyed during the Second World War, and then boomed back to become hugely profitable again afterwards. And now I think entering this sort of third age of, I get the negative way you can look at it is post-industrial, decline, a bit like the sort of US Rust Belt. There's plenty of empty factories and towns that feel a bit downtrodden, but also a lot of examples of, as you say, quite beautiful new uses for old industrial architecture, landscape parks where they converted old refineries and tankers into climbing walls and event venues, and you go and find music concerts. Or I went ice skating inside an old factory in Germany where they'd put an ice rink inside this riverside factory. And so you still have that beautiful, romantic, castle-strewn, historic area of the Rhine, if that's what appeals to you. But there's also this very youthful, dynamic part as well, where it's all graffiti and pop-up bars and people with tattoos drinking craft beer and working on their MacBooks and that kind of thing, which is, and I think for me that mix of having both there is part of the appeal of the river, that it goes from old to new and modern to historic almost within a few kilometers sometimes.
I couldn't agree more. I really enjoy that contrast, especially the contrast between the middle Rhine and the lower Rhine is extraordinary. Incidentally, talking about the industrial part of the Rhine, one of the, well, you don't know, but I'm going to tell you, one of the most popular excursions with Viking guests on a Rhine cruise is a visit to the Mercedes factory, and which I've done and I would love to do, and I could quite understand why people want to do it, because there's something fascinating about how factories work, and particularly a factory as iconic as the Mercedes one. Anyway, so how I mean, this can lead us on to just a little bit of a discussion maybe about how relevant is the Rhine today. I mean, you described pretty well it's how it has been in history, but you've also indicated that a lot of the industrial landscape is now in decline. And I mean, does it still have relevance, the Rhine, as a border, as a cultural exchange, as a place of culture exchange, as an artery for trade?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm obviously quite biased here, but my answer probably won't surprise you that it's yes. I think these days there's perhaps a natural tendency to think of rivers as a bit old hat. You know, these days we all travel by plane or train or car rather than boats most of the time. We work on our laptops or in office buildings rather than in factories or heavy industry along the river, most of us. And to the extent that we think of rivers, whether it's the Rhine or the Mississippi or the Seine or whatever it would be, it's not as a sort of dynamic place that's the lifeblood of the area where we're living, but more as just a sort of scenic backdrop where you might take the dog for a walk or have a glass of wine on a sunny Sunday. But I think in the case of the Rhine particularly, it's still definitely, if you travel on it, has the feel of being really the lifeblood of a certain part of Europe. As I mentioned briefly before, I mean, there's certainly a lot of places where it feels like time has stood still. And if you go south of Koblenz, for example, the hike through the forests to these neo-Gothic castles on the hilltops, looking down at the rocky slopes leading down to the water or into the vineyards, then it all feels much as it would have 100 years ago or even longer ago. But there's also these enormous cities, you know, places like Rotterdam, Düsseldorf, Basel, Strasbourg, are still incredibly dynamic, successful, wealthy places, really places, I think, where, you know, a lot of Europe's big decisions still get made, or a lot of money gets made. Rotterdam, as I said already, the biggest port in Europe, so the real sort of engine room of the Netherlands, helping pay for all those nice liberal cliches that everyone focuses on in Amsterdam and the prettier places. Düsseldorf, very dynamic modern city with a beautiful modern skyline and really sort of bursting with money, it feels like, when you walk around the shops there. Strasbourg, almost on the border between France and Germany, in many ways one of the nerve centres of the European Union, place where the European Parliament meets a lot of the time. A lot of the big decisions affecting the continent get made. As we've said already, still a lot of heavy industry. Some industry has declined, but still, as we've said, you know, huge factories and refineries and power stations, all powered by the Rhine. If you are buying a new pair of running shoes or a tin of paint or a car part in Rotterdam or London or northern Germany, there's a good chance that it may have come to you along the Rhine or out of the mouth of the Rhine. And so I can appreciate that if you sort of just focus on the history and talk too much about the Romans and that kind of thing, it might feel like just an ancient history tale. But if you spend any time in the places along the river, I think it really still feels like a very dynamic place that's really quite central to the future of Europe. And that's one of the things that appealed to me about spending more time there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed in at the northern end of the Rhine, the lower Rhine, just how busy it is. I mean, those huge barges powering up and down, and anybody watching now who's taken that itinerary will know what I'm talking about. It quietens down a lot as you move further along, but particularly that northern part of the Rhine is just so powerful. I mean, what we're looking at now is that's the middle Rhine, where it all gets very calm and there's castles on every hilltop. I mean, let me throw a question at you, Ben.
Sure.
This is from Cassie in Garden City in the United States. And she says, what are your favorite small towns on the Rhine? There you go. What are your favorite small towns on the Rhine?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. It's tough to choose, to be honest.
There's a lot to choose from, aren't there?
Yeah, I like, there's a couple of the German ones. It depends a little bit how you define a small town, I suppose. I have a bit of a soft spot for Koblenz in Germany, which is sort of one of the more northerly, I suppose, German towns on the Rhine. But just a very beautiful, slightly overlooked, often, I think, German town on a point in the river where another river flows into the Rhine. A beautiful fortress high up on the cliff overlooking the town. You can get a cable car up and walk around the fortress and then have a beer sitting by the river. You can board a cruiser or a boat and head down to that more romantic section that we were just talking about with the castles and forests and vineyards and so on. But then it's also right on the cusp of this more industrial stuff. So I think actually if you climb up to the fort, you can even see in the distance the sort of chimneys and fires of the big cities to the north. And that's really the sort of transition point between the sort of more industrial south and more beautiful north, I think. Is more beautiful south, sorry. That's probably one of my favorites. And I also had a bit of a fond spot for Liechtenstein, which is a bit harder to reach by boat. But for those who don't know, a tiny country, effectively a sort of city-state nestled next to Switzerland, right near the source of the Rhine. Whole country, you could, well, there's a lot of mountains in the way, but you could probably walk across it in a matter of minutes if there weren't the mountains there. Nice capital city, Vaduz, about the size of a small American hamlet. Another beautiful castle up on the hilltop, but quite a sort of quirky, unique character. A king who still has a big role to play in national politics. A lot of dark money flowing around, and people doing mysterious things, parking their BMWs and so on. And I found it quite an enchanting place. Almost feels like you're going to a sort of Shangri-La, high in the mountains, hidden kingdom. So that's another one I'd recommend to visit if you ever get the chance.
Fantastic. Basel, that's another nice one.
Yeah.
I love Basel too. Here's a question: how clean is the Rhine water?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sorry.
So you've been swimming in it, so you must have an idea. Yeah, how? I mean, I guess it changes in cleanliness from its, as you move along it, does it? Or?
It does change, yeah. I mean, inevitably, the further north you go, so the nearer the mouth, the more sources of pollution there have been before. So the dirtier it gets and the more industrial it gets. But overall, I have to say it's pretty clean. I think 20 or 30 years ago, that definitely wasn't the case. There was a lot of very alarming reports in sort of the mid 80s, early 90s, pointing out that in some places, literally almost all of the fish and marine life had died off. I think it was 1984, if I remember correctly, there was a big fire in Basel in one of the chemical factories next to the river. The fire brigade came, pumped loads of water and foam in to put the fire out. That all flowed into the river, and the river even turned red for a while outside. I think you can still, it's a bit before the age of social media, but if you Google, you can still find photos of the Rhine in Basel, literally looking this kind of bright salmony red colour. And there was quite terrible pollution for a while then. But then, thankfully, that sort of crisis point in the 1980s provoked a bit of a change in policy. There was a lot of painful work to put together international treaties between Germany and the Netherlands, for example, on pollution flowing into the Rhine, a lot of effort to clean up the factories. As you said, it helps that a lot of those factories sort of closed anyway for other reasons, economic reasons. And anyway, the end result of all that is that if you fast forward to today, it's really quite impressively clean, actually. I mean, considering that it is one of the main industrial arteries of Europe, with, as we've said, all these factories and power stations and so on, it's quite amazingly clean. You have all sorts of fish reintroduced in the Netherlands. There's beavers been reintroduced in the Biesbosch, living in the waters of the river around in Alsace and around Strasbourg. You've had breeding of storks, these beautiful big white birds you now see on chimneys and treetops around there, which were almost extinct 15, 20 years ago. And almost everywhere, it's there's probably nowhere along the Rhine where I would really hesitate to take a swim at this point. As you say, Basel is probably the best, partly because it's a bit further up before the heavy industry. But swimming there, I think, for me, was one of the highlights of the whole journey. Actually, yeah, you've got some photos there, I see.
Ben, you have to tell us about this, because I mean, people who don't know will think you just got your swimming trunks on and jumped in the water. It's actually, this swimming thing in Basel, it's a thing. I mean, people go to work like this, don't they? And just tell us what's going on in these pictures here.
Yeah, it's really a known thing, and they do have certain days of the year where they have sort of swimming festivals, as it were, and everyone jumps in the water. But it's also just quite common to do at other times. And Basel, for those who don't know, it's I think it's 180,000 people, I think. So it's a fairly sizable town by Central European standards. Classic sort of European architecture, the cathedral up on the hill and the beautiful town square leading down to the river, fairly hilly and mountainous, because you're sort of almost on the shoulder of the Alps there. But then flowing through the middle of this quite busy, bustling, prosperous little city, you have the Rhine, which is at that point just come out of the Alps, just come out of Lake Constance, and is still very clear and clean, and this almost sort of turquoise color if you go on the right day. And the water looks like you could just scoop up a cup of it and drink it. And so for that reason, it's extremely popular for swimming. And as I say, for me, that's one of the highlights. You sort of walk down early in the morning, take off your clothes, jump in. There's a bit of a current sweeping you along, but it's pretty gentle. A lot of people take an inflatable bag to put their clothes in and give them a bit of buoyancy, and then you can just sort of lie there and float downriver past the big church, past Erasmus's grave, under the bridges, and past all the people having their morning coffee on the terraces by the river. And then when you get a bit tired, just sort of paddle to the side and climb out and walk back, all soaking wet. For me, that's quite a special experience, that combination of sort of feeling that you're swimming in an alpine stream almost, but then you're also in the heart of this very, very bustling historic city. So another highlight. If anyone's ever in the area, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I haven't done it, but I really want to do it. The day I was there, I wasn't able to do it, but I was watching people, and actually, you say the current wasn't. I mean, the day I was there, the current was pretty strong. People were flying down that river, and I mean, I was thinking, I'm not sure they're going to be able to get out. I mean, that was the part of the problem. But
yeah, it does vary a bit, I think, depending on the time of year, how much rainfall you've had and how much snow has melted in the Alps and so on. So you probably need to be careful that you don't end up in Rotterdam if you don't pay attention.
Be one way to get home. And
Yeah.
Well, anyway, from swimming in Basel, you were by that time you were in Switzerland. You were nearly at the end of your journey down the Rhine, at its source. Which is in a place called Lake Thoma. So how did it feel? How did it feel to, because it's a long journey. How did it feel to actually get to the, and just explain, Ben, what this lighthouse is that we're looking at?
Yeah, this lighthouse here. So, I mean, the Rhine, as you can imagine, it sort of flows through Europe. And if we're following it in reverse here from the mouth to the source, gradually gets narrower and narrower, as you would expect. Going through Liechtenstein, it's, the size of a city canal or something, fairly mundane channel flowing through the bottom of the valley, and then quite suddenly it sort of turns rightwards and flows up the side of this mountain, down the side of the mountain obviously, but if we're following it in reverse here, and becomes really almost immediately this narrow mountain stream. And the scenery there, it reminded me a lot of Scotland actually. It's sort of very rocky, mountainous, lots of colourful heather and sort of sandy colour. You can see a bit in the background of that photo there what the scenery is like. And the Rhine at this point is really, I suppose, a couple of meters wide. The lighthouse there is at the top of the pass where the Rhine flows down from, and where the road goes over the Alpine Pass. And the lighthouse is actually, it's a twin of one that's exactly the same that used to stand at the source, the mouth of the Rhine, sorry. So you have one at the source and one at the mouth near Rotterdam, at Hoek of Holland. The one in Rotterdam was actually moved a few years ago and replaced with some ugly modern beacon, but now stands still next to the harbour in Rotterdam. So if you're not physically at the mouth, but if you're in Rotterdam city, you can go and see this lighthouse that's identical to one standing a couple of thousand meters up on top of a mountain in Switzerland, which is quite a nice, neat symbolism. And then from that lighthouse there, if you sort of cut off across the hillside, I guess a little bit in the background there, walk maybe half an hour or 40 minutes or so, following a little, almost like a goat track across the hillside, very rocky and quite steep, patches of snow on the ground, even in the summer. And eventually you come to, I think you had the next photo there, the Lake Thoma, the Thomazee, which is officially the source of the anterior Rhine.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's very beautiful. The photo perhaps doesn't quite do it justice, but if you imagine you've sort of hiked across this hillside and come up from the valley bottom, and you're surrounded by all these dry, stony peaks, and then quite suddenly you rise over a rock and look down, and there's suddenly this expanse of water there. This was a bit of a dull day when I took the photos, but a very bright, clear mountain lake. And that's my dog there, you can see in the fetching yellow mountaineer's coats, standing on the very first bridge over the River Rhine. So this is really like meter 3 or something where it flows out of the lake, and is just before that, it's pretty much narrow enough to step over at certain times of year. And you can see, so here the lake would be on the right there, and then flowing down the hill to the left into Switzerland and Germany and France and all the rest of it.
Was that an emotional moment for you, Ben? I mean, it was the end of quite a long trip.
Yeah, it was, to be honest. I mean, I suppose the Dutchman in me is, or the Englishman is used to repressing feelings a little bit and being quite straight talking and reserved about these things. But it did feel like quite a moment when you think that you've sort of followed this river all this way and cycled all these miles and swum in all these places and walked over all these mountains and all the rest of it. And then you finally get there. And I found it quite remarkable that it probably sounds a bit cheesy now, but I remember I picked up a leaf and tossed it into the lake there and watched it flow away down the stream. And it's quite remarkable to think of it flowing down through all these different countries and lakes and past all these great cities and ruins and cathedrals and wars, and maybe eventually flowing out into the North Sea somewhere a few weeks later. It's quite a special moment, I think, to see that.
Just flowing past your front door, almost.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so go and grab it at the other end.
Let me just read you something from one of our most loyal viewers, Mike in Montclair in the United States. Hi, Mike. Who just, I won't read it all out because it's quite long. She said, I sailed from Basel to Amsterdam about 2 years ago. I did not have enough eyes to see both sides of the Rhine, and I abandoned the dinner, ran upstairs from side to side. Yeah, so she's just saying what a great trip she had. And I would second that, by the way. So Margaret in Puerto Rico, hi, Margaret, says, as far as I know, the Dutch language contains the sound of most languages, so it is easier for the Dutch to speak other languages. Yeah, there's probably some truth in that, would you say? There's a bit of German in there, and
yeah, that's an interesting one. I never thought of it that way. I have noticed, I spend a lot of time working in Africa in the past, and you notice that when it comes to sort of more obscure African languages, trying to learn Chichewa or Luganda or whatever it might be, Dutch people often seem able to pronounce these syllables or vowels that are quite unpronounceable to an English speaker. I think there's a bit more range there, perhaps. So there's probably some truth in that. Yeah, one reason why they're such great linguists.
Ben, we've been talking about the Rhine. I mean, you got another book, another river, another trip? What's anything you can tell us about, or do you want to keep it?
No, I won't go into too much detail, but I'm trying to work on a couple of things at the moment. It's been a bit tricky for the last year or so, as most people will be able to imagine. I think basically in the Netherlands, been unable to travel outside the country. So all the trips I had planned have dried up. My wife and I also had a baby recently, which puts a little bit of a damp, has many benefits, many joys and delights, but puts a little bit of a dampener on the adventurous long-term travel plans. But I am working on a couple of things, one specifically about the Netherlands, a little bit of I guess, a sort of humorous memoir of life assimilating here and learning language and those kind of things. And then also something else that's a little bit more in keeping with the Rhine, sort of broader zoom out, a few more rivers, more countries. So watch this space. Maybe I'll come back in a year or two and announce that I've finished.
Well, Viking soon will be sailing down the Mississippi. You could maybe, it's got to be a book there, Ben. I'm sure.
I'd love to do it. I'd love to. Yeah.
That'd be great. One question I didn't ask you earlier on, but whilst we're on the subject of the Netherlands, it's a place that has a reputation of being very, from the outside at least, very tolerant, very liberal, a laid-back sort of place, a country where drugs are semi-legal and prostitutes pay tax. As someone who lives there, Ben, would you agree with that assessment? Are the Dutch really as liberal as we think they are?
Well, I mean, perhaps inevitably, I think the stereotype is exaggerated a little bit. I think people often sort of see a little bit what they want to see in the Netherlands. For example, a lot of foreigners, if they come to the Netherlands and only spend a few days in the very center of Amsterdam, they probably leave with the idea that everyone's a vegetarian who smokes weed for breakfast and cycles to work and doesn't work very hard and is very laid back and liberal. And the reality inevitably is a bit more diverse than that, particularly if you sort of step outside the center of these historic cities. I'm sitting right now, for example, in the tail end of the Dutch Bible Belt, which is a thing, believe it or not, which sort of more conservative, big Christian population here, quite a different politics to some other parts of the country. If you go further to the east, you also have these very big rural areas where there's fewer big cities, less of an international feel, I suppose. So inevitably, it's a more diverse country than the sort of the cliches would suggest. And I do think there's a strain of sort of Dutch conservatism that goes against those liberal cliches and instincts a bit. We focus a lot on the prostitution and the euthanasia and the cycling and the recycling and all the rest of it. But there's also this very strong tradition of it's historically quite a religious country, a Catholic south and a Protestant north, but quite strong religious cultural values and family values and so on. It's a country where there's, for obvious reasons, been a huge emphasis on physical order in the sense of maintaining dikes and building infrastructure, keeping everything neat and tidy. And I think that's probably had some effect on the world view. You know, this is a country where if you want to go and dance half naked on a boat at Gay Pride in Amsterdam, that's fine. The neighbours probably won't think much of it. But if you leave your front driveway looking messy or forget to wash your windows for too long, then people will really sort of tut and nod and disapprove of your hedonistic ways. There's definitely that instinct there. But having said all that, I mean, I shouldn't overstate this. It still is, if you look at almost every measure, an unusually liberal and tolerant country compared to most others in Europe. If you look at the sort of role of liberal and green parties in parliament, as well as the far right ones, things like support for gay marriage, or the proportion of people who, I think it's 90-something percent, 96% even maybe, of Dutch people said they'd be perfectly happy having a gay prime minister, for example, which you wouldn't see in a lot of other countries in the world, I think. No, so it still there's definitely a different feel here compared to even somewhere like the UK. It feels to me these days a much more sort of conservative and less tolerant place in those ways than the Netherlands. Yep,
I would certainly agree with that, Ben. Our time is almost up. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us and taking us on a journey along the Rhine. It's been really fascinating. I think the first time I did it was in 2014, and I haven't really done it since. But I can't wait to get back on a boat. And it's such a, there's such a lot to look at, and you're never bored for a second. And I think when you know more about the history and about the, all the kind of things we've been talking about tonight, it makes it even more fascinating. I should just show the viewer. This is the book. We get it there. There we are. That's Ben's book. Or James, we can maybe pop it up on the screen. And I highly recommend it. It makes me want to go on a trip immediately. It's informative and it's entertaining. Congratulations, Ben. You've got another book about the Dutch, which is why they're different, which is also a pretty interesting read. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'll let you get back to dealing with a 4-month-old child. Good luck with that, Ben.
Yes. Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. I hope people enjoyed it. And I hope to see you out on the river sometime soon.
Well, I'd love to buy you a little small glass of Dutch beer someday. It would be a pleasure.
I would like that very much. We'll
Take care.
That.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
There we go. Thank you to Ben, and thank you to all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again soon on Viking.TV. Thank you and goodbye.
Our Rhine Getaway itinerary presents all the highlights of the legendary Rhine in just 8 days. Your journey begins in timeless Amsterdam. Soak in rich colours amid the stained glass of Cologne's Gothic cathedral. Explore the mighty Ehrenbreitstein fortress that overlooks Koblenz, and enjoy an evening stroll along the cobblestones of Rüdesheim. With dawn comes Speyer, a quaint German town on the Rhine's west bank, where you can marvel at the architectural splendour of the city's Romanesque cathedral. Strasbourg, France follows with its timeless old town, while Germany's Black Forest region is rich in history and culture. Your voyage concludes in the pretty city of Basel, Switzerland.